And what is that, sir?
That, Charles, is my new Porsche 928 S4.
Shall I have the chauffeur put it in the garage?
Fire the chauffeur.
Welcome to the channel, everyone. There are a number of films that precede this one, which focus on the Porsche 911 and the Porsche Boxster. I will link to these in the description, and you can also click on the pop-out in the top right of the screen. For this film, however, we are moving away from anything Porsche has made with the engine behind the driver, and will focus on the Porsche 928. Yes, not even a flat 6 anywhere in this video, but rather a thumping great V8 positioned in the more traditional location on a car, and a car that attempted to change and even succeeded in changing Porsche's destiny. It lasted for an incredible 18 years. I've built a one-pager guide showing all the different models in the 928 range, which I will talk you through, and we'll look at them all and what the differences are, what the pros and cons are of each one, the jargon, and what the rarities of the range are. So then, before we look at each model and variant, let's look at the context and history, and it's a well-known story. By the 1970s, Porsche considered that the 911 had run its course. It was still viewed as a quirky car, and the then managing director of the company, Ernst Fuhrmann, believed that Porsche would go on to have more success with a more conventional car, more purposed for grand touring than out-and-out sports cars. Rather, a combination of sportiness and comfort amidst flagging sales of the 911 in the mid-1970s. So Fuhrmann gave instructions as early as 1971 for a design study, which, over time, yielded the 928. Interestingly, given that the 911 was an evolution of the 356, this was Porsche's first ever clean sheet design for one of its own cars. Multiple engines were considered, including a V10, which, because it was based on a Volkswagen engine, was rejected, until they settled on a 4.5 litre V8, with large bore spacing and thick aluminium barrels without steel liners, and a very long timing chain, this being one of the items to watch as it expands and contracts with the heat cycle of the engine. In a characteristic that would last for half the model's life, the US engines were crippled and only pushed out 219 bhp versus 237 bhp for the first of the rest of the world cars. More on this as we go through the range though. The finished new model was presented to the world at the Frankfurt Auto Show in 1977 for the 1978 model year, and remarkably was awarded the European Car of the Year award. Remarkable because that award was and is usually given to manufacturers of smaller, efficient family cars. So futuristic was this car. Also sold alongside the 911, which never did get cancelled. That's for a different video though. It's also worth mentioning that the 928 had something called the Weissach rear axle, an early passive form of rear wheel steering. Really advanced stuff for a car born in the 1970s. The 78 and 79 cars were styled the same everywhere in the world, despite the differences in output, and it really depends on where you are in the world for what 928 you got from there. Porsche treated the US separately from the rest of the world, and there were even individual differences for other countries like Australia too. We'll try to cover them all, but it is hard to track them. The early cars in 1978 and 1979 were predominantly manual cars, compared to the later models which were mainly automatic, so don't pay too much more for an early manual car. So the first cars were all 4.5 litre V8s, and everywhere except the US got 237 bhp. That might not sound like a lot by modern standards, but let's not forget that the 911 Turbo of the same era was pushing out a rather similar number. The first big change came in 1980 with the advent of the 928S, which gave it a dramatic increase in power up to 296 bhp with an increased size 4.7 litre engine. The car moved away from Bosch K Jetronic fuel injection to the Bosch L Jetronic setup and added higher compression. The new S also had larger brakes and front and rear spoilers. Again, the US was the bespectacled ginger stepchild and unfortunately US customers didn't get the S model until 1983, and they had to put up with a tiny 10 bhp increase up to 229 bhp. The 928S in most parts of the world stayed pretty much the same until the advent of the 928S4 in 1987. It got a slight increase in power up to 306 bhp in 1984, and in the UK only those cars were called the 928S2 and had the later Bosch LH Jetronic fuel injection and electronic ignition, which were both things that would go on to be used in the later 32-valve cars. As I mentioned before, the US finally got the S model in 1983, although still nowhere near the power of the Euro models at just 234 bhp, which was lower than even the very first Euro cars. Times did improve for US customers in 1985 though, when Porsche put the 5-litre 32-valve V8 into the 928S and gave it 288 bhp. Still a little less than the Euro model of the day, but comparable now for the first time. Before we get to the S4, it's worth mentioning that if you see a 1986 car, then check its VIN. If the number ends in 1001 or later, then it'll be what's known as a 1986.5 car, which had the brakes from the S4. So then, the S4, the first and only big refresh of the Porsche 928 in 1987. Styling was rounded off, and extremely evolutionary rather than revolutionary, and a 5-litre 32-valve engine was installed for all markets. The S4 pushed out 316 bhp until it was replaced by the GTS in 1992. Even the hitherto poorly treated American customer base got the same power as everybody else for the first time. The S4 also sprouted some variants too during its time. The Club Sport or CS model was a lightened version of the S4, shaving 220 pounds or 100 kilograms from the S4's weight. These were called SEs or sometimes S4 Sport in the UK. 5 prototype models of the CS were made for Porsche racing drivers of the day: Derek Bell, Jochen Mass, Hans Stuck, Bob Wallach and Jackie Eakes. Club Sport models were only made for 1 year across 1988 and 1989, and then in 1989, because the CS was slow selling, Porsche added the GT model, which, like the CS, was manual only. The GT added 10 extra horsepower and a higher spec level compared to the CS, whilst also keeping weight down. And this brings us to 1992 and the 15th year of Porsche 928 production, and the new GTS model and final refresh of its overall 18-year run. Porsche added a 5.4-litre 32-valve engine, pushing out 345 bhp for all markets. This car cost over $100,000 in 1995, which was one of the most expensive cars on the road at the time, and despite its luxuriousness and long list of standard equipment, it proved too expensive for most, and hastened the 928's demise, sadly. Production ended in 1995 after just 61,056 cars. To compare, Porsche built over 170,000 of just the 996 variant of the 911, so even though it was a long run, comparatively few cars were built. There were a few special models along the way. Porsche built 205 Weissach edition models for the US market in 1982 and dialed the luxury up to 11 with leather everything and matching luggage. In the same year, the rest of the world got 141 versions of the 50th Jubilee edition, or sometimes called the Ferry Porsche edition, because his signature was embroidered into the front seats. In 1984, things got even quirkier with the Porsche 942. This was a one-off gift for Ferry Porsche himself, and a feasibility study for a larger Porsche. It was based on the 928, but stretched by 254mm, or just over 10 inches, and then given the front and rear of an S4, 2 years before that model was launched, and the 5-litre 32-valve engine. Porsche also tested a long wheelbase model with AMG, and also produced the car known as Study H50. If you can think of a weirder or, well, let's be generous, quirkier looking car, I'd like to know about it. Well, that about wraps up our look at the Porsche 928 across the years. I haven't mentioned anything in this video about how hard and expensive they are to work on. If you're interested in that, then why not subscribe and follow me doing just that on my own Porsche 928. Otherwise, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.